Just recently, CD Projekt Red shared big updates on Cyberpunk 2077, including their plans and directions for the future of this game. And I gotta be honest with you, some of what they said during this was pretty concerning to me. Not that I think they're going to be dropping support for this game outright, but in the timing of some of the content and potentially in reduced support going forward, which I actually think there is some evidence of. There are a few quotes and a few things said during their recent earnings call that have definitely raised some concerns for me overall, especially the more I think about it. And the first and one of the most important things to highlight with all of this is how it seems like the biggest non-expansion updates for Cyberpunk 2077 are well behind us. We can see from this employee breakdown chart and the yellow bar specifically how the number of people working on Cyberpunk 2077 right now, that not including the expansions, is at the smallest point ever, and in fact is actually at a smaller scale than they have on a current Gwent project, which seems pretty crazy when you consider the scale of Cyberpunk compared to the scale of Gwent. And even further, this is probably a bit too optimistic of a look, as this data in this chart is 2 months old now. So if anything, there's probably even less people working on Cyberpunk right now. So what that means is patch 1.5 is almost certainly going to be as big as it gets. I can't imagine a patch 1.6 will get anywhere near that size. So for those holding out hope for an updated or overhauled police system, it just doesn't seem like that's super likely to be coming. I mean, yeah, just look at the difference in the amount of people actually working on the game from even just a year ago to now. And even on that note, as far as big updates go, it definitely seems like there's a decent chance that patch 1.6 is the last big one. CDPR describes how they are working on the next update, 1.6, which will be out in the coming months. Afterwards, support for Cyberpunk will continue, but our focus will gradually shift to new exciting endeavors in both Cyberpunk and the Witcher franchises. Which to me, that quote does suggest two major things. On one hand, patch 1.6 is probably still months away. I imagine if it was coming out in the next couple of weeks, they would have hinted at a more near release date, not in the coming months, which considering it has already been over 2 months since the release of patch 1.5, seems like we are definitely only getting a handful of big updates per year. But even on that note, I move to the next point. It seems like patch 1.6 may be the last major patch before the expansions come, and considering, as we'll talk later about in this video, the expansions aren't coming until 2023, that may end up being a pretty large gap. This one's definitely a bit more speculative, but just based on their wording here, how support on Cyberpunk will continue, but our focus will gradually shift, and how this is mentioned in the context of the next big update, it just makes me think it's going to be a shift away from these big, larger scale updates, and rather we'll get smaller scale bug fixing updates, kind of like what we've been seeing after patch 1.5 in this interim between patch 1.5 and 1.6. And you have to imagine this yellow bar is only going to get even smaller. I know if that isn't even that big of a deal. They have done a ton of work on Cyberpunk 2077 and gotten it to its best state to date, and there are a ton of people working on the expansions, as we could see from the growing and very large already light blue bar. But to me, it feels like CDPR is starting to run into a problem where everything just took too long. Fixing Cyberpunk 2077, to which I think the game right now is in a much more healthy and playable state, which was essential. I'm not suggesting they shouldn't have done that. I'm not sure I would necessarily consider the game completely fixed, but again, in a very good state compared to where it was on release, and definitely a vastly improved state. But getting to this point took nearly a year and a half, which means everything else got pushed back as a result. So now we have things like free DLCs, of which 6 came out, but supposedly there are 17 in total, and they're just kind of sitting on them. We can data mine things like a transmog system, new weapons, and even a couple of simple new gigs that are probably going to get added in a future free update. But a year and a half later, how much interest is there still in that kind of small scale content? That's kind of stuff you hope to see in the ensuing months after release. Feels like CDPR was put in this really difficult position where they didn't want to start releasing new stuff before the game was actually in a more healthy or fixed state, but fixing the game took so long that now that it is time to start releasing the new stuff, players want something more. They don't want just a new weapon or one couple minute long gig, they want a new quest line or hours of new content to reinstall or replay the game. And of course, this doesn't apply to everyone. There are still people that are experiencing the game for the first time or stuck with it, never uninstalled it, and are regularly playing it. But regardless of which chart you look at, you could see a lot of players have stopped playing since launch, and that's not a shocker. That's how games work, especially single player games. And when it comes to the smaller scale content, it does seem like, based off the data mine, that there are 11 more DLCs they still have to release. which you have to wonder when or how are they releasing them. And to me, I definitely think there are several clues that CDPR internally has, over the past few months or maybe 6 months or so, made some decisions and changes around the scope of their extended content. Since the beginning, they have wanted to bring both multiplayer and at least as many DLCs as The Witcher 3 to Cyberpunk. This was always the plan for this game. There's a bit in the middle where people thought multiplayer was cancelled. This was honestly just a bunch of journalists misinterpreting what CDPR said, but a month ago it seemed like, okay, the game is getting multiplayer and 2 major expansions, but from where I'm sitting right now, I don't think that's the case. On the side of multiplayer, I think that just might be dead as far as it comes to Cyberpunk. When asked about this, they said, at CD Projekt Red in the past years, we worked on creating our multiplayer technology. In the wake of a recent decision to start a strategic cooperation with Epic Games and to use Unreal Engine 5, which offers advanced multiplayer solutions, we ceased further development of our own multiplayer technology. We're now switching our multiplayer activities from Red Engine to Unreal Engine, and we abandoned further work on adding multiplayer features to Red Engine. To me, this really sounds like multiplayer for Cyberpunk 2077, which is based on Red Engine, is just outright dead. They're going to use the inbuilt multiplayer in Unreal Engine instead, which honestly makes a ton of sense. The original plan was to implement multiplayer functionality to the engine and bring it both to Cyberpunk and The Witcher, which made sense when their future plans continued development of Red Engine and meant they would be sticking with it. Future titles would hypothetically then have multiplayer support. You do the investment now, add it to these current and past games, and for years or even the next decade or two, you could be reaping the benefits. But now, with all future projects moving to Unreal Engine 5, it really just doesn't make a ton of sense to devote all these resources to adding multiplayer support to 2 aging games. To me, it seemed like they were obviously adding it to Cyberpunk, but I had a feeling they had a plan to implement it for The Witcher 3 also. And to be clear, they had an entire studio internally dedicated to this. It was a relatively small studio, last estimated around 40 to 50 people, but still, that's a significant amount of manpower just working on multiplayer functionality. And although they haven't come out and explicitly stated that multiplayer for Cyberpunk is dead, even if you just look at the way they're talking about multiplayer with their games, it seems like the plans for this have been pushed significantly in the future. Just over a year ago, they were describing how Cyberpunk 2077 was going to basically get a multiplayer game of sorts. We don't just call it a mode, it's a separate dedicated production and we think about it as a standalone project. To now, a couple of weeks ago, on the topic of multiplayer, they say, we're definitely for having multiplayer content in our games, we need those people to help us make it happen one day. As if this is a distant hope, not just a concrete project anymore. But as I mentioned before, I wouldn't be shocked if the curtailing of planned content doesn't stop there. The biggest news from the recent investors call was how the first expansion would not be coming until 2023. That is far. That means a full 2 years between the game release and the first expansion, and that is just not ideal. You have an issue with install base. Yes, people will return for the expansion, especially CDPR, who have made some of the best expansions in gaming ever, but there are likely a good chunk of people who have uninstalled Cyberpunk 2077 and are never coming back. The greater the gap, the greater the number of people who will be addicted to new games and just move on overall. But even further, this now raises the question of how many expansions will there be? For the longest time, it's just kind of been accepted that CD Projekt Red was going to create several expansions for Cyberpunk, this being at least 2. But they've never actually said that concretely as far as I can tell. All of the facts or data we have around expansions is around a quote that came from around 2 years ago, where CDPR said on the topic of Cyberpunk 2077 DLC, expect no less than what happened with The Witcher 3, which would suggest that there are at least 2 major expansions, since The Witcher 3 got 2 major expansions. But now, 2 years removed from that quote, it just seems like a way bigger stretch. If the first expansion isn't until 2023, when would the second one be? Even further, CDPR has definitely been saying expansion a lot and not expansions, which definitely feels like a change. On Twitter, after they announced the new Witcher game, the Quest director did comment, and I can't wait for a time when more could be revealed about Cyberpunk 2077 expansion, not expansions. And maybe people are just reading too deeply into that. He's just hyper-focused on the first one, so he referred to it in the singular. There definitely was a bit of speculation and almost an outcry around that though. But I think what's a bit more informative is the recent earnings call, where despite talking about the expansion numerous times, and of course announcing that it would be coming in 2023, they never once actually use the word expansions in the plural. They only ever say expansion in the singular. And this is different. If you look back at past earnings calls, when they talk about expansions, they basically always say expansions. But in this most recent one from a couple of weeks ago, we just get expansion. Now, okay, maybe I'm just reading way too deeply into this, but at the same time, this is another one that just would make a lot of sense. The game's sales figures are almost certainly disappointing to CDPR. 4 million copies sold in a year and a half isn't great. The game sold nearly 14 million copies in the first month, but then everything after that was only 4 million total. So when you couple that with the obvious timing issues, expansion 2 may just not be possible until 2024, and maybe at that point it's not even worth it. And overall, I think we find ourselves in a pretty interesting and perplexing spot with Cyberpunk 2077. We have this big window now of potentially a year before we get concrete, solid new content, outside of just some of these other updates like patch 1.6, which will likely bring a couple of small new feature additions, a couple more of the free DLCs, probably those gigs, the transmog system, maybe even some of the new weapons. And all of that's great. I'll definitely be covering it, and I'll definitely be playing it and enjoying it. But if you're just looking on the larger scale, when you're looking at the age of the game and players' expectation for new content, there's a long wait before some of that meteor new content is coming. And you have to wonder what it's going to look like 6 months from now when we're still potentially 6 months away from the expansion and there just isn't a ton going on with the game necessarily. Some of those other things like mod support could potentially swoop in and really be a huge boon, but just feels like the clock is ticking, and I think CDPR finds himself in a difficult situation. Now, as of right now, we don't know if the multiplayer mode is canned. We don't know if there won't be a second expansion, although technically I guess they haven't really confirmed there would be 2 expansions ever. Again, as far as I could tell, they just said more than The Witcher 3, which even that, it got blown up by the media, but it wasn't like CDPR concretely said, yes, we're going to have 2 or more expansions, definitely. It was literally just a reply to a guy named Stockwitcher on the internet. But all in all, with the most recent update, those are my thoughts. It was just sitting with me for a while, and I kept thinking about what the next 6 months to a year will look like for this game. Mod support could definitely completely shift this. It would get me incredibly hyped for the next 6 months of this game, but it'll be interesting to see how things evolve and what happens. I can't imagine we'll get many concrete answers to these questions because CDPR hasn't been talking much, so this will probably be all we have to go off of this recent earnings call for a while now. And with that said, it's still a phenomenally good time to play and experience Cyberpunk. The game's not doomed. I actually have a ton of fun with it still on a rather regular basis. And it's probably the best time to pick it up ever. You can get the game discounted, it has consistent and regular sales, it is in the most bug-free status it has ever been, and if you're on PC, there are a ton of phenomenal mods adding in some of those highly requested features. I recently made a video looking at several of those if you're interested. But with that said, it is hard to ignore what feels like a ticking clock with the Cyberpunk 2077 extended content. It definitely feels like CDPR, although not abandoning the game, has restructured their forward goals compared to where they sat a year ago. And with them just recently announcing a studio-wide shift to a completely different engine for all future titles, doesn't seem like that'll really help things. Either way, those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments down below. As always, again, I thank you all for watching. I do hope you enjoyed this one, but with that, I hope to see you all next time. Later.